Good morning. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. So today,
Jose, you're muted. You're muted.
okay. Can you hear me? All right, perfect. Sorry about that. So today we finish the second and last part of chapter 14, whose title is Division of Labor and Manufacture. But before we get into the stuff of the book and the stuff of chapter 14, Matt, are there any thoughts you have about how things have been going, how poetry been going, how are things?
Things are good. I'm wrapping up this week. I'm wrapping up my goal was to get done by October 1st, so I'm gonna be able to do that. Well, my goal really was to get done mid-September, but so I could spend the rest of the time editing. But I should be done with the book today and tomorrow. I should be finished the last piece, and then after that, I can probably spend like 3 or 4 days just like really editing and making sure that the things are the way I want them to be. And then but I'm really excited about that. Really excited about that.
Cool. Well, the semester has begun for me, and so things are tight, but we're making them work, and I certainly appreciate opportunity to be in conversation with you, and I really enjoy the questions and comments and words of support. Even welcome critique, because without it, there won't be opportunity to question and examine and counter-examine. So certainly, this is, I need to confess something, if I haven't confessed it already, Matt, and those that might be watching us, that this constitutes the first time that I read the book from cover to cover. I've read the book in portions over the years, but I've never read the book cover to cover. And so some chapters and some ideas are relatively new to me, although previous reading, however fractured it's been, has given me some reference to make some sense of things as things proceed. But nevertheless, I welcome folks' observations and even things that I might miss. I welcome, I really do, opportunity to learn from others as well. So having said that, Matt, I want to share that chapter 14 for me is really interesting because it gives us an opportunity to see, at least for me, and given my background in sociology, chapter 14 is where I begin to see Marx write as a sociologist. Chapter 14 is one where I begin to see Marx write as a sociologist that is looking at the ways in which society is in the process, and particularly with regard to the United States, as he writes in the middle of the 19th century, how society is making its transformations from an agriculturally based economy over to a hyper-industrialized society, right? And complete with the corresponding divisions that inevitably take place, right, as a result of major technological shifts in society. Before I get into this stuff, I'm interested in asking you if you have some general comment about chapter 14 and Marx's attention to the division of labor, and really the ways in which history has, the history of technology in labor has an impact on society more generally. I don't know if you have something you might want to share about that.
Well, in this chapter, he's talking about a lot about how there's a certain complexity, a certain labor, and that put in everyday language, simply multitasking, right? So like if you were to put together a shoe, you're gonna have to know how to do several things, right? You're gonna know how to make shoestrings. You're gonna know how to cobble a shoe together. You're gonna know how to mold rubber into the bottom of a sole, right? So you have to know certain things. And so once you get these machines, they're able to create one job for one person, right? You will get the mold, you will do the dye, you will do the string, right? And that way you can mass produce things because you have everyone on this line working just on strings, everyone on this line working just on that. That in many ways it kind of disempowers the laborer, it disempowers the worker, right? So even if let's say you had some specialized labor and you didn't own the means of production, you didn't own your tools that you're producing, you weren't the one who was going to receive, who was going to take the products to the market, right? If you have a certain specialized set of labor, you still would be empowered in some way. Whereas if you have that stripped away from you, you're not going to. The most interesting thing to me though is that as things progress with technology in our time, is that so many of these jobs that were not necessarily exalted or seen as this highly skilled thing, but require multitasking, are the jobs that really are very difficult to automate. Working a retail worker, for instance, a sales associate, very difficult to automate. A maid, someone that's working to housekeeping, that's difficult to automate. What's actually easier to automate than a domestic worker is actually a radiologist is actually easier, or people that scan the charts for radiology, because that is repetitive work, and anything that's repetitive, a machine can do better than a human being. So anything that's just repetitive, a computer is going to do better than a person with more exactitude and quicker. But anything that requires kind of split sections, split thinking, oh, I was doing that, now I'm going to do this. As of now, the human mind is far superior to the computer. So that's that's
really,
kind of
it's really interesting. Radiologists, be careful.
Well, it's the people that they look at the radiology. I forget the exact position, but I remember reading about this. It's in a book by a guy named Martin Ford called The Lexington Tunnel. He's by no means a Marxist. He was just really looking at the technology of automation and where it's where things are headed. But yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'll tell you, I was reading chapter 14, and I was thinking then about a few things, and as our talks have been proceeding over the last 6 months or so, and even from the get-go, from the time that we started to do this work, we've been thoughtful about the ways in which this book and its understandings about history more generally might be used or can be used to understand the history of Chicana and Chicano people, not just in the United States, but also, Mexican origin people, right? As much in Mexico as here in the United States. And so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about things that I've read in the past concerning the division of labor by race, right? And thinking about the fact that in places like the LA metropolitan region, the people that do some of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous work, are Mexican origin people, the people that are falling off of scaffolds, for instance, the people that are twisting their back, doing service work in the care industry, people with arthritic wrists and hands that are doing work in the restaurant industry, etc. And I was thinking about this also in relation to the training and the skilling and the education, the schooling that is used to explain and justify why it is that some people inevitably end up doing literally back-breaking work. And this chapter is really useful and very interesting and very thought-provoking to arrive at least for me, preliminary understandings about how it is and why it is, that Mexican people, Mexican origin people are doing such dangerous work. I don't mean to say that other people are not doing dangerous work. I don't mean to say, that that people aren't sacrificing themselves for, if not for the economy, for the people that depend on them. I don't mean to say any of that. It's just that the focus of our work begins with attention to Chicana and Chicano people. So that's the line of thinking as far as our work is concerned here. Anyway, I was thinking then about some terms here. The term, of course, technology that we've discussed before, and then technology's impact on the shop floor, really technology's capacity to generate the kind of divisions that you were talking about just a few moments ago, right? So that by way of the introduction of technology, workers' tasks are divided. And to the extent that workers' tasks are divided, it's to that extent, and to the extent that surplus value is generated, right? Whole industries begin to be divided, begin to function semi-independently, such that, excuse me, such that the materials that are used in the production and the manufacture of a shoe, for instance, can be processed and mechanized under one roof, right? And so that facilitates that industries or that manufacture, that shop's division from other shops. And so this has, as a consequence, the generation of larger divisions in society, such that some people work in one area, other people work in another area. And as wages are divided on account of the introduction of technology, as divisions of workers under one roof are created, so too are divisions of amongst workers more generally created in society across the spectrum, if you will, of the variety of industries in society. I was thinking about this, and I want to keep on talking, but before I do, I just want to ask you what you think about this, so that I can begin to later on, by way of our discussion, begin to talk about the training and the de-skilling that takes place deliberately, such that some people are relegated and excluded to the more dangerous spheres of employment, to the more dangerous spheres of society.
Yeah, I mean, what we're looking at is, when you talk about the people that experience that, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but
yeah.
But looking at like this question of technological drives, I mean, you can look at it's not just like what happens with the individual worker. It's, I mean, how like societies are totally reshaped. I mean, if you look at like a lot of the innovations of, like, let's say the 17 kind of the 18th to 19th century, right? Well, looking at the 1700s, late 1700s and the 1800s, you see like a lot of the countries that today are known as kind of the industrial giants of the world, almost all of them have experienced some type of almost civil war or a really huge conflict as to like how society is going to be restructured. In Japan, you have the Meiji Restoration, which is all about, you know, like the modernization of Japan. And in Germany, you have the fight, you know, the unification, you have the creation of really Germany out of the former Prussian state, with the, you know, in the Bismarck fighting with the Junkers. You have in the situation with in the United States of America, you have most clearly the Civil War. Um, in in you know, I don't know. This is kind of a constant, you know, like
Yeah.
you see this happen, you know, also over centuries. You see it happen in England and the Netherlands, but and in France as well, I suppose. But you know, very very specific cases in Germany, Japan, and America, where like, you know, the coming into the railroads essentially, and all the railroad technologies upend what was going on. Now, obviously, in the United States of America, there's much, you know, there's a larger moral um, fight against, you know, slavery. I mean, that's not really what's driving. That's really not what's driving. You know, the capitalist. I mean, it's morally wrong. That's not why they're doing it. I mean, but so I don't want to reduce it just to economics there, because there's a lot happened here in America at that time.
Yeah.
But if you look at the driving force, it really was the railroad versus the landed gentry, right? Which is essentially what's going on in Japan, essentially what's going on in Germany, essentially what would happen later in Mexico, later and Russia as well, which is like
Yeah.
things being reshaped by these new technologies coming in and the demands of a new society to be shaped around these technologies. That doesn't mean that like things are going to get better. It just means that things are going to be just different. And the demand that things be different is what thrusts all this into motion. So what happens in those situations when, you know, that's kind of like, you know, going on like kind of an imperial core? Well, what happens to people who essentially are the colonized, right? Well, what happens with colonized people is that generally speaking, typically speaking, they have an economy already. They already have an economy. Now, whatever that economy is, it could be highly exploitative, it could be less exploitative, it could be communal, it could be whatever. But they have some kind of form of economy that gives them has them able to claim a certain amount of land is ours, able to have a certain amount of resources that they already know how to get out of the ground, already have, you know, and a certain amount of human beings living there, right? So a certain complexity of society required to have like a lot of human beings, right? So you know, so they already have land, labor, and resource, and that they gets, you know, circled and funneled around amongst themselves. They already have an economy. What happens when they get colonized is that the colonizer comes in, violently overthrows their political structure, and then absorbs their economy into the larger colonial economy, right? So that's what happens, and that's why in, you know, France you'll see people who are, you know, working, you know, we'll call like you know, what we call or secondary labor, you were calling it earlier, you know, working the jobs that are not well paid, and are, you know, are not well paid and are dangerous,
Yeah.
um, and coming from former colonies of France. That's why you'll see in Germany. I mean, I don't know, the relationship with the church is a little different, but you'll see like a lot of people like working there who've been in Germany for generations, still not called Germans. You know, they're called guest workers, and you know, they're like 3 generations in.
Yeah.
Uh, that's why you'll see. I mean, you go across the board, right? But that's why you'll see all these situations. Well, in the United States of America, there was a war. There was a war in the 1840s called the Mexican American War, and in this war, you know, people who got displaced were called Mexicans, and and to this day, they work in those low paid and dangerous positions
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the United States of America, and that's the way things are ordered, and that's the way things are naturalized to be, and that's the way um, we're educated that it should be. I was really interesting. I was actually recently writing a screenplay with a friend of mine, and I kept like having the father talk to the daughter in this way. Was like, well, maybe you can't be a doctor, but you could be a nurse. That's a good job. He said, well, why wouldn't you be a doctor? And they just, and it wasn't that they didn't understand where I was coming from. It's that I didn't understand where they were coming from. I did not understand this idea that you didn't proletarize your dreams. Like I just didn't get it. Like because I was like, oh, the son's the favorite one. Okay, so she'll be less favorite. It was just a whole different thing. But this idea that you like don't shoot for the stars, shoot for something lower, and that's like a good job for you. Like that's incredible that you were able to do that. But
Yeah.
the idea that you should be the doctor yourself, the idea that you should be this, that you should be that, that you should be at this the highest peak level, you know, like when writing it, it just you know, like, and my whole life is about like talking about like, yeah, I'm the best, I'm the best, and any one of you could be the best, right? But like when I'm actually sitting down and writing,
Yeah.
it didn't even occur to me that someone would just encourage. I was essentially writing a Mexican family. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Where expectations were diminished, where they
Yeah.
were lowered. And it was like, hey, people be proud. People be proud. Hey, you were, you know, the such and such and such, such. You were this and this. It wouldn't be seen as a failure to be have, you know, be hold a position that was high within some structure, but certainly not the top, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't be seen as failure at all. It would be seen as like, you know, the success of the family, success of the extended family, right? But I couldn't understand writing for someone who like really thought that they would be a doctor, like they would have their own medical office, and they would. I mean, I can understand writing for like the head nurse. I can understand writing for like, you know, like I couldn't wrap my mind around that. It was no, I took a minute, and I eventually got it, but like, but that was the kind of position
Yeah.
that the Mexican people have been put in this country. So even if they do somehow, you know, break through some types of ceilings, there's still like this kind of this thing pulling you back, telling you that, you know, like you cannot strive for the very best. You should really be happy with what you have, and you know, like you made, I don't know,
The
that's at this level, right? But then the levels like the more that's like the uncommon level, right? So what I'm still describing is uncommon. I'm still describing an uncommon mentality. The more common mentality would be just like, this is what we're supposed to be doing. This is how we're supposed to be doing it, and we work hard, and there's pride in your work, and and creating a whole ideology around the substandard position that we've been forced into. You know,
the there's discussion. You know, I'll share an anecdote from work that I did when I was a high school teacher in Oxnard. And at that time in Oxnard, I was working at a high school where there were a lot of folks from Samoa, a lot of Samoan students and a lot of Filipino students that were at this particular high school where I was working. Channel Islands High School. Maybe some folks out there know where I'm talking about. And I had a student a Samoan student, a young woman was my student, and I'll never forget her. This is, you know, decades ago at this point, but I'll never forget the exchange that I had with her. She was one of my star students in class, and she shared with me that her objective was to become a nurse. And I asked her, well, your performance, your attitude, um, you know, your contribution to class, and even your leadership in class would is different. You know, I have a sense of the fact that you're on your way to become a physician, a doctor. Now, without normalizing all the cultural baggage around, you know, the work that people do and status and that kind of thing, at least for the moment, um, it's useful to think about the ways in which uh, colonized people's existence, inherited as it is, you know, by individual people and in communities of people, correspond to those things that they believe are normal and to be expected for them, given their position, given their place in the in in the hierarchies of society. And I'll never forget this, you know, I'll never forget it. And it makes me think then also about the experiences of my students over the years. You know, I've been a school teacher throughout the educational pipeline. And um, even now as a university professor, a great, and you know, I haven't taken count of this, but it doesn't surprise me that those kind of expectations, those kind of professional inclinations that I witnessed as a high school teacher, you know, an hour north of here, by people, you know, that have been colonized and have existed on the other side of the planet, right, are similar to the sort of expectations that my students at the university have, and particularly the Black and the Chicana and Chicano students. Often share with me, again, without normalizing the, you know, all the cultural baggage around different work, at least not for the moment. Many of my students pursue employment as social workers, as cops, right? Many of my students see, this sort of employment as apt and appropriate for them. And when I introduce the possibility that with a university education, students can pursue, a more diverse option of employment opportunities, I sometimes catch them off guard, and they never thought to consider themselves possibly as lawyers, as architects. Again, I'm not normalizing, at least I'm not trying to normalize the culture around these jobs, but it's just that, these are typically the safer jobs. These are typically jobs with more levels of autonomy and authority than the other ones to which they aspire. And this is even amongst university educated people. What do you think?
Well, I think that's why they went to the university. They went to the university with the expectation of becoming social workers or becoming whatever. Then they go to the university so that they don't have to work with their hands, so essentially, right? And the idea is to work in an office, to work at a desk, to work at whatever. And I don't want to disparage anybody's hopes or dreams of what they intend to do with their lives. And it's really not about that. That's what you want to do. I mean, that's those are good paying jobs. I mean, I'm not the cop part, but the rest of it, those are good paying jobs. You make a decent life for yourself, and why would I begrudge anyone to make a decent life for themselves? That said, what we're really looking at though is the idea that certain positions in certain stations in the economy should be precluded from you, right? That these jobs that are few and well paid should instead go to groups of people who are smart, and that's not you. And then you don't come from one of those groups, and therefore that should just be precluded from you. That you have no business doing those things. And so it creates a weird situation with those who are able to do it, because for whatever reason they're able to, their family has tremendous amount of resources, they're able to get through things, they themselves are driven or have some type of thing in them. It makes it oftentimes that people that are able to achieve these things you're not supposed to achieve within this system typically are complete sociopaths, horrible human beings. You know what I'm saying? People that really end up breaking the mold, 9 times out of 10, it requires them to be like very, very nice, aggressive people. And that should not be the case. Go to a place like Cuba, you meet, there's the highest doctors per capita anywhere in the world, and they're able to become doctors, and they're fine, they're normal. It's a society that we have built up, right? It's a society we have built up. So that's why I'm not really big on championing like the people that like the exceptions to the rule and this and that. The thing we have to do is not create more exceptions to the rule, because people who are exceptions to the rule are socialized in ways that, like, look at me, I'm so unique, I'm so different, I'm so great, whatever. It should not be so unique to have a medical doctor. That shouldn't be so weird. That should be so strange. That shouldn't be whatever. It should not be so unique to have somebody have some position, a pilot or something like this, right? That should not be totally out of the ordinary. That should not be something that's just seen as like it shouldn't be so exceptional. We need to live in a society where that there's no station of labor that is that is the way the things shouldn't be as they are, and they shouldn't be as they are for everyone, and for the whole society, not for just certain individuals to be able to break through. Because again, we're talking about larger social structures. It's obviously a different conversation, but even in this context, I mean, most people you meet that are with the exceptions to the rule, they're just as bad and just as elitist and just as whatever as
of course they get some people I won't mention names,
I would
but
say, but I would say most. Like, I mean, like, I wouldn't say everyone, but I would say most. I would say the
yeah,
majority. I mean, at
yeah,
least the ones I've encountered, the majority, like the wide majority,
yeah,
which doesn't mean everyone. It just means the wide majority.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's transition now that we've kind of set the stage for chapter 14 by shedding light on not just anecdotal evidence, but just patterns, historical patterns about which we know. We can now begin to understand the terminology in the book in chapter 14. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to summarize a portion here. And then I'd like to summarize a few portions here. That way we can get into discussion, a little more abstract and a little more theoretical discussion in a few moments. And I'd like to say then, in this particular chapter, and in this second portion of the reading that we're doing, where collective labor acts integrally, right? That is, where workers, right, are put together and function together as a unit to create a single set of commodities, and where each individual of that collective has unique training. Each individual has different value. This explains the hierarchy of wages. Here then is language to explain and locate and to map, right, the secondary labor market that we've been talking about. Marx writes, hence, manufacture begets in every handicraft that it seizes upon a class of so-called unskilled laborers, a class which handicraft industry excluded. And so the division of labor in society, and then the corresponding tying down of individuals to a particular calling, develops itself, Marx writes, just as does the division of labor in manufacture, from opposite starting points. He proceeds to write in ways that are of interest to those of us who are concerned with understanding how it is that a young Samoan woman in Oxnard desires to become a nurse. He says, divisions. He then proceeds to write in ways that are of interest to those of us who have these particular interests. Division enlarges its materials by the expansion of the community, and more especially by the conflicts between the tribes and the subjugation of one tribe by another. The discussion that takes place here is one that illuminates corresponding divisions in production with those in society more generally. To this point, we have not really seen a sociology per se, at least in the chapters that we've been reading so far in Marx's work. His attention to the US is thus a source of his examples. His attention to the United States in this particular chapter, right, is thus the source of his examples from which sociological explanations concerning capitalist divisions in society surface. His attention to division of labor in manufacturing industries, which have as their potential to isolate branches and make them independent on account of technology, have also capacity to generate corresponding divisions in society more generally. This is Marx's more contemporary materialist understanding of history. So that to the extent that equilibrium on the shop floor is generated by the imposition, the introduction of technology, to the extent that equilibrium is established on the shop floor by way of de-skilling some people, skilling other people, and of course I'm using the word skill in quotes, by way of paying people differently and creating these hierarchies, right? Patterns are established. Social patterns and patterns of interaction amongst people, groups of people are established, and then these patterns infiltrate society more generally, and they set the stage for the divisions that exist in society. Hence, it is a law based on the very nature of manufacture that the minimum amount of capital must keep increasing, that the minimum amount of capital must keep, that the transformation into capital of the social means of production and subsistence must keep extending. Capitalism and its bourgeois logic of competition require its incessant push to accumulate. This requires a division of labor and of society that in its zombie-like existence is always en route to an average mediocrity that makes surplus value and the labor that is its primary commodity a necessity.
See, that's absolutely true. Like, just generally speaking, though, that's true with or without looking at, you know, what I guess is referred to as racial capitalism these days.
Yeah.
That's just true. I mean, like, in generally speaking, like when you what Marx was writing about is like how did England come to be capitalist? Essentially, like the majority of what he writes about is how England became capitalist. And he'll talk about, like, you know, like the handicraft. He'll talk about like enclosures. He'll talk about all these kind of things like that. So generally speaking, that's true. That's the process of proletarization, wherein these things are only possible because the factory exists, right? You can't just will these things to happen. That happens because there's a certain technological basis of which society is being reorganized around, right? Now, of course, it takes on the political manifestations, takes on social manifestations, takes on like woes, and takes on changes in legal structures in order to make these things actually happen. But what makes it possible is a certain level of technology. What we're describing when you talk about like you know, the hopes and dreams of people who are, say, let's say, of Samoan descent, of Mexican descent, Puerto Ricans, you know, African Americans. We're talking about all these. What we're talking about now is groups of people who have been historically oppressed. Now, when we say historically oppressed, behind that is what? What does that mean? Well, it means different things in different places. But you know, if we're trying to find catch-all term, it means colonialism. It means colonization. It means theft. It means war. It means conquest. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't just so happen. It's not like it just so happens these people are da, 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 da. It just so happens that these people find themselves in these lower positions, and therefore they struggle, and maybe one day this can happen. No, this is on the basis. This is on the basis of theft, of conquest, of stealing, that has been going on for centuries. That puts people in position to drag you into their economy. You know what I'm saying? There's a reason why you don't have. There's a reason why there's not, like, you know, just floods of, like, you know, European workers, you know, going into to Africa looking for jobs, like going into like North Mediterranean looking for jobs, Southern Mediterranean looking for jobs, and it goes the other way around. Well, it's because of colonization, it's because of colonialism, it's because of war. There's a reason why you don't see all these Anglo Americans going into Mexico, like, you know, like begging to find work and to whatever. There's a reason why the situations are reversed. And that reason is not because of superiority or anything. That's the reason is not because of just better. No, the reason is because of history, because of murder and bloodshed and chaos and mayhem and destroying the economies that previously existed in those places. You know what I'm saying, and pulling people in to the situation where all those things you used to do, all that human activity that you used to do that will compose your economy is now going to be fed into our economy. And Marx writes a lot about this, about the relationship between England and India, where he talks, you know, about, you know, the hand weaving and the things that were going on, the local economies there in India. And he writes, I think, in many ways, oftentimes very incorrectly, about the relationship between England and India. But he does write about how, you know, the Indian, all that manufacture, all that handicraft that was going on in India is absorbed into the English economy. You know what I'm saying? And that is what we're looking at. That's what we're looking at throughout the world. Is people who had this previous economies, who had prior systems and ways of being pulled in to something else. So if you look at like what happened here, you know, we're talking about here, you know, in the Western Hemisphere, and specifically we're talking about what happened with Mexico and the people of Mexican descent, the people in the Southwest. You're talking about like the conquistadors. You're talking about the Spanish conquest and
Yeah.
invasion. You're talking about you know talking about like Teotihuacan becoming like Mexico becoming Nueva Spain, and like all this kind of stuff being like all this wealth absorbed and pulled into Spain, later financed by England, later financed by the Dutch, and this becoming like kind of one of the main genesis points of the wealth that will be accrued in Europe. And so it's all interconnected. And then and then centuries on later, you're looking at the fact that people who come out of that history are still at this kind of like position of proletariat.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. There's a reason these people are put in the position they're in all throughout the world, and those reasons are easily traced, and they don't have to be described in that complex a way. The complexity is in like, well, how do we get out of it? How do we untangle it from? How do we untangle our um, from a web of lies and interconnected, Marx describes commodity fetish, but we kind of like create this like colonial fetish. We create this like kind of position in our own head to describe the world and understand our place within it. That is chock full of lies and misleading information um, that was developed to make us continue to work and continue
Yeah.
to take positions.
And to normalize our quote unquote integration or incorporation into an economy, right, that is exploitative, and that the nature and the quality and the quantity of the exploitation that takes place for people like us, right, is distinct from the quality, quantity, and extent of the exploitation that takes place for other people. And so, there's, I want to transition into a discussion now about the employment itself. I want to transition into a discussion then about the so-called de-skilling of people, and then their their containment. We used the word containment last week. Their containment within a particular station, within a particular position, so that they can be exploited in a very particular way, in a very distinct way, as far as industry, the more general industrial set of relationships are concerned. And I'd like to begin to address this by sharing a short paragraph that's here that will help us to get at this particular theme. It says, Marx writes, in manufacture, in order to make the collective laborer, and through him capital, rich in social productive power, each laborer must be made poor in individual productive powers. Ignorance is the mother of industry as well as of superstition. Reflection and fancy are subject to error, but a habit of moving the hand or the foot is independent of either. Manufacturers, accordingly, prosper most where the mind is least consulted, and where the workshop may be considered as an engine, the parts of which are men. As a matter of fact, some few manufacturers in the middle of the 18th century preferred, for certain operations that were trade secrets, to employ half idiotic persons. Makes me think about not just the de-skilling of workers, but the imposition and the elevation of superstition, of unscientific ways of conceptualizing the world to ensure an ignorance and an absence of grammar with which the grammar, the strategy of the shop floor might otherwise be understood. it's upsetting. It's upsetting because, I have a recollection, I have a memory. When my kids were very young, I was at school advocating for the establishment of a bilingual education program. And in this case, my son at the time was just starting kindergarten. And I made sure to set up a meeting, not just with the parents whose children were in the so-called ESL track with my son, but also a meeting with the school administrators, et cetera, even with the PTA to get the ball rolling on something like this. And I was told very matter of factly that what I was pursuing was not going to be obtained. It wasn't going to happen. And the resistance that I was getting for the cultivation of language, the amplification, extension, um, expansion, of literacy in two languages, not just in English, but in Spanish, in the case of our kids, was put to a halt by a school administration that wanted to reserve its funding and resources to the children in this particular school that were coming from families from another part of the neighborhood, families that were coming from neighborhoods where the property values were generally higher, and the number of apartment complexes in those neighborhoods was significantly lower. And so, of course, if you think about it, if you think about this down the line, those kids who were, those kids whose cultural opportunities were restricted and narrowed would eventually, then occupy the sort of positions where they might be more easily controlled, where they might more easily be manipulated and contained. And those kids down the road in the future that were coming from those neighborhoods, right, would be given more authority and control on the shop floor. Of course, the shop floor doesn't exist the way that folks thought it was going to exist, some 20 years ago or so. But anyway, this particular quote is useful to begin to understand that, and then even to think about, and this is, I guess, a delicate subject, but makes me think about the employment of people who haven't been integrated in the school's mainstream, if you will. People who have been labeled a particular way and have consequently been tracked in a particular way, such that on account of their mastery of grammar, their capacity to read, are more easily contained in spheres of employment that are highly exploitative.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, first of all, we can't naturalize, like, we can't, when I say naturalize, I don't know, naturalize is such a weird word. Normalize, we can't, normalize is not the word I'm looking for either, but we cannot think of 95% public literacy, 99% public literacy, 90% public literacy, high public literacy as this like inherent normal thing. Like this thing just like springs from the earth, like a mountain, or the sun that we've rotated around, right? No, we have the reason we have such a high literacy rate, the reason why we have like we say, like, we're talking about illiteracy as like the social ill, it's a horrible thing, and and it is because to not be able to read in a situation where most people can read, that's not that puts you at a really huge disadvantage. So I'm not saying it's not an issue. What I am saying though is that, like, the reason we have such a high literacy rate, the reason why many nations have such a high literacy rate, is because of public schooling. But public schooling, as we understand it, this industrial level public schooling, we understand it, has not always been here. I mean, this comes out of after this comes in a period of mass industrialization in the United States of America, when, like, public schools become become this thing that we have to that are basically there to train people for the position that they're going to have in the economy, right? So that's where they come from. That's why they're here. That's why they came up. That's why they were segregated. I mean, for the majority of the time that they have existed. That's why, I mean, things only become desegregated. Like, I don't know. Well, it's 2020 now, but the time I was born, they'd been segregated longer than they hadn't. Um, so like, they've been segregated about half the time they've existed.
Yeah.
And so like as they have existed, I mean, public schools, I think the first one in the United States is like 1850s, some of that. But but the real big mass explosion was with the mass explosion of the cities. When the cities started rising up, that's when we need that, because you need people who knew how to read and knew how to write, and knew how to do certain
Yeah.
amount of things, so they could operate machines in factories, and so that they could, like, okay, how many bricks? Look at this many bricks. Okay, how many of this? If people could read instructions, so that's what you needed. Um, it was there to service a need, and that need was the need of the capitalist, right? They needed workers who had a certain level of capacity, right? And so they
And a
did
certain
not,
level of literacy.
a
I'm
certain
sorry.
level of literacy, certain level of literacy, and they did not want their, they did not want black proletarians, they didn't want Chicano proletarians, they didn't want a certain amount of workers to have the same level of education as the white ones. They didn't. So that's why they had segregated schools, and that's why they fought in so many ways
Yeah.
to keep the schools segregated. And that's what. And when I say segregated, I just literally mean you're not sitting next to each other. The fact that you have unequal education to this day, you have unequal education. Why don't we have a federally funded education system? Why do not we not have like this federally funded public education system where every school gets the same amount of resources, where every school gets the same amount of resources, and there's a general, just kind of like, yeah, that, right? I mean, there've been lawsuits about it. I mean, San Antonio, what was it? Rodriguez from San Antonio in the 70s. They were suing to have just like just like, okay, across the board standard public education, that not based on like the
Yeah.
school districts and stuff like that. Of course, they wouldn't do that. And I think in one of the rulings it said something like publication is not public education is not a constitutional right.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of thing, that's kind of mentality. But yeah, so that's why we have public education to begin with, right? Now, but you take away that need, you take away that factory, and you'll watch what begins to happen, which is the closure of schools. And that's already happening. That's been happening. Like schools just being straight up closed down. I mean, I remember in Philadelphia one day, like
Yeah.
15 schools closed down one day. I mean, it was back in like the early 2000s. But you'll start seeing that. You'll start seeing the privatization of schools. You'll start seeing charter schools pop up. This kind of ultra capital kind of way of doing things. Kind of this is the kind of stuff that was happening. This is the kind of stuff that happens all throughout. All throughout. This is what happened in Chile after
Yeah.
Pinochet came to power. I mean, this is what happened. This is what happened in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union fell. This is what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane
Hurricane
Katrina.
Katrina. Yeah.
Right. So there's been a kind of a wave of of the whole reason why public schools came into being is kind of like is making its exit. I mean, it's not gone, but it's making its exit, right? And so there's this idea like, well, let's get the money while we can. It's a fire sale essentially, right? So that's where the charter schools come in, and when there cannot be money, let's close school. Let's close it down. Well, what's the purpose, right? Same way that they'll limit the amount of like sanitation department or something like that. Just let trash pile up in the street. Um, and that that's a mentality. I mean, we really have to get around the fact that we really have to get around our minds wrapped around the idea that that the economy we live in is owned, and it's owned by incredibly wealthy individuals who live on a system of exploitation. And the way they look at us as a means to get rich, and that's it. People that
Mm.
really own the economic structures just see us as a means to get rich, and the government is essentially their will written down. And these things that we look to that we're supposed to participate in, we're just really seen as something to be managed, and that's it. And contained, managed,
Yeah.
contained, exploited, and that's really what you are in this economy. You are managed, contained, and exploited. And whatsoever is generally true is even more true for the victims of historical colonialism. So whatever is just generally true is even more true. And the degrees to which it is true vary. But like that is the situation we're living in. People that own everything see us as something to be managed, contained, and exploited. And the people who we look to as our quote unquote civic leaders, are, like whatever, the government, mayors, governors, judges, they carry out the will of the ultra wealthy, and that's just the way. That's the way things are, and they aren't another way. I mean, the complexity of society is in the carrying out of that program. That's what makes society complex and layered. But that is the program. The program is relatively simple.
The the challenge the challenge for us in history is to make history. The challenge for us in history is to recognize these relationships, and then to act upon this recognition, right? So that schools, since we're talking about schools, we recognize what the plan is. We understand what the strategy, what the blueprint is, what the architecture of the school system typically is. But then, of course, having recognized that, having appropriated grammar, having appropriated technology, you know, those of us who have been exploited as we've been exploited can intercede and intervene in the development of history. Our task, as far as this book is concerned, is to understand it. At least that's my task, is to understand it, to understand its grammar, and to think about its grammar in relation to those things in which I exist. And hopefully we can get folks to think about, the world in which they live, how it's mapped, how it's organized, and where the fissures exist, where the crises exist, and where history can actually be made. We're at the tail end, Matt. Do you have poetic closure for us?
Sure. I mean, like I'll just do this kind of a signature piece. I'll just do this one. This one makes sense for what we're doing today.
Sure.
Los Angeles full of abuelas raised grandkids in Spanglish, and the watchful eye walked in with the Virgin Jesus. Like a village out of a duplex raised Catholic, but the roots are indigenous. 7 generations of family extension all growing one plot. Hand-me-downs into shared rules, rooms, and reflections. In la quech, porque mi casa es tu casa, and that's my promises, family living. That's palabra. It's like candle. Burn some sage, pick your saints that you also sign of the cross. The sound of the contra prayers lift four directions. That's culture, not contradiction. Folks in the back, they fight for living. 515 hail from the rowdy section of Dodger Stadium. The hearts still burn with the fire from the Chavez Ravine, and here is home of Lorena. At 54 cents on the dollar, America's most exploited worker. Neglected, disrespected, underrepresented, and presumed incompetent. If she lives life as expected, she'll be labeled statistic. If she managed to outpace them, threaten, they will blame her for affirmative action. But either way, they will not see her. They will demand her labor, paid and unpaid, smiling, her eyes humble and her mouth silent. Lay the river. Cities past, present, and future. The Queen of Angels. Invisible to those who float. Through canyons, lagoons, and cemeteries, whitewashing adobe, through a series of fevered dreams connected by a bridge called her back to those who make demands. To stories told to bury the past, the ones that serve to remind her that she works for them, that she is lucky to even have a job here in El Pueblo. The Señora La Reina, Los Ángeles, Rio por cinco, La Rosetta, it's called La La Land. 78 with the Pueblo. 18 has breakouts of Montebello, built one again, only being shot. Only for no Mexicans, no dogs, only for no different set of rules, different set of schools, only written out of the history of a city we found as we are priced out of the homes of our mothers. Yet more and more of greater Los Angeles suddenly discovered this is the struggle of forebears. Un por pan, historia de las victorias, siempre the struggle is real. La lucha sigue la reina. De Los Ángeles on the front lines of every fight, holding it down, holding the better half sky, fighting education, fighting for education, fighting for tenants' rights, fighting la migra, el juro, because fuck police, chingala ice, fighting for dignity, hers and ours, all the damn time, proud and brown and brown and proud, the hearts and hands, the backbone, these raised fists, they fuck Donald Trump, we throw 2 fingers up, that's not identity politics. There's a cry of the proletariat at 54 cents on the dollar. She is the face of us when you see her, pushing some other mother's shoulders, locked behind cash, raising the 3rd, 4th, 5th, shifted the oppressed, show some respect, bow your head, bend the knee, all hail La Reina, the once a future queen.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt. All right. Hopefully the work we do has some, gives folks some language to consider as they go about their week, and I look forward to chapter 15, our next session, 24th.
Yeah.
Wow.
24.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate it.